And I'm here with Barak Sina today, a senior research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society and host of the geopolitical podcast, The Geo-Godfather Wars, who has written a report on restoring deterrence, destabilizing the Iranian regime. Barak, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you tell us a bit about your report and your motivations behind writing it?
I noticed that there was a dynamic that was taking place in the Middle East that while the tensions have spread all over the region, I don't see it as the Israeli-Hamas conflict spilling over to the wider region. I actually see it as Iran fomenting tensions across the region that includes Gaza, that includes Lebanon as well. And something that I have noticed is that while Iran, over successive administrations, has targeted US assets across the region and barely incurred any response whatsoever, this has culminated in America focusing on localizing tensions and de-escalating tensions. In the meantime, Iran is very much focused on escalating tensions and regionalizing or even internationalizing the malign activities. And so I wanted to also identify what was it that enabled Iran to not only extend its sphere of influence across the region, but mold the entire region in its image. And something that I had also identified is that if America or Israel does respond to Iran, it's at a symptomatic level, it's at striking at their proxies, it's not at holding the regime itself accountable for its disruptive behavior.
In your report, you call for a much more sort of aggressive response from the US. I think you mention military activity in Iran's territory. Do you worry that there could be an escalation then in conflict rather than it diffusing tensions, it actually escalating conflict and resulting in a more violent war?
I think that axiom that you have would be legitimate if you're talking about a rational actor. So if there's an actor that is behaving in a rational manner and it's accountable to its population, then indeed a hostile act against it would lead to a dramatic reprisal. We've seen the inverse when it comes to Iran. We've seen a non-responsive approach being hugely provocative, incurring greater disruptive behavior by Iran. And in turn, Iran is inching towards the nuclear status. As it as it inches towards becoming a nuclear power, then it feels that it's even less accountable. Could you imagine Hamas, the Houthis, Hezbollah conducting its attacks with a nuclear umbrella? Then it would be a disaster. One wouldn't even be able to respond to their proxies. So I actually think that projecting power in a greater manner onto Iranian soil to destabilize the regime will actually put the regime back in its box and ameliorate any of its actions.
All right. Yes. No, that does make sense. In terms of its nuclear capabilities and how Iran is continuing to develop its nuclear weapons, would you call for strikes on the facilities that it's using to create nuclear weapons, to develop nuclear weapons?
I would. I would say that I would be targeting not only nuclear facilities but drone and missile facilities, IRGC bases, or senior IRGC personnel, perhaps air defense capabilities and airfields, or their oil infrastructure, which would include refining and processing facilities, that it would be a wide array of targets that are all geared towards destabilizing the regime and make them incur a huge cost for their malign activities.
What do you think Iran's response would be if the US were to attack, or any Western alliance was to attack strategically important for Iran facilities in their own territory?
The the and my anticipated response from Iran would be that they would tell their proxies to quell their actions, to actually stop striking US facilities, stop striking US assets, stop striking Israel, and it would undermine Iran's entire regional strategy.
Mm. But equally, wouldn't it it would destabilize the government as well and the Ayatollah, because they would be seen internally as bowing down to Western pressure, and
I
would
think
that
that their strategic priority is to preserve their regime.
mm,
And and as such, they would want to just ensure that there will not be greater attacks on their facilities and infrastructure that they identify as preserving their rule. So, however ideological they are, they want to maintain the guardianship of the ideology and the rule. And they'll do anything at all costs to preserve that. So if they see that America or Israel would be striking at the heart of their regime, it would cause them to reassess.
do you think it puts Israel at greater risk if the US started doing that? Obviously, it would require Israeli support. Do you think Iran would take it out on Israel, as it were, without being able to target US assets because it's too high risk? Would they then go after Israel, the weaker partner?
Iran has a strategy of uniting the arenas whereby it seeks to encircle Israel and while increasing its strategic depth. And the way it does that is by its usage of proxies. The recent attack 1 or 2 months ago directly from Iran to Israel of rockets and missiles was a huge escalation, and it was also unprecedented because until now they just rely on their proxies and they even hide behind their proxies. So the Houthis are around 3,000 kilometers from Israel, whereas parts of Iran are 1,700 kilometers from Israel. So they are really using their proxies to encircle Israel, Hezbollah in the north, Hamas in the south, now other jihadi organizations via Jordan and the West Bank, which can also destabilize the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. Therefore, by not holding the regime accountable, that puts both US assets in the region and Israel in a much more precarious position. In contrast, by willing to disproportionately respond and hold the regime accountable, that will actually shore up the security of both US and Israel in the region.
And are there any other ways that the US could put more pressure on Iran? I'm thinking in terms of sanctions. Obviously, they haven't been particularly effective, but they can be. Or cyber attacks targeting, rather than using missiles and drones, using something, yeah, like a cyber attack or comprehensive sanctions regime to destabilize or cripple even certain aspects of the Iranian economy or nuclear weapons development.
When Iran is on the threshold of becoming a nuclear state, sanctions aren't going to be that effective anymore. there's no doubt that one needs a comprehensive and complementary approach towards, adopting punitive actions against Iran. However, Iran's managed to circumvent Western sanctions by trading its oil with China,
Mm.
and gravitating towards the East's sphere of influence. That in turn has created a more tightly growing alignment between the axes of resistance, Russia, Iran, and China. So we can't rely on these elegant tools such as sanctions.
Yeah.
One has to escalate. In the past, one would have usually have perceived deterrence and military strikes as mutually exclusive. That military strikes was a result of deterrence breaking down and a lack of interest in that policy option. It would be a shift from deterrence to preemption or deterrence to prevention. I think we've reached a stage in history where all policy options have either not been pursued against Iran or have failed, and therefore deterrence and military strikes against Iranian facilities and personnel on Iranian soil have become synonymous with one another. That just demonstrates the extent at which deterrence currently lies in tatters.
And you mentioned Russia and China there, which is something that I wanted to get onto. The Iran has been increasing its relationships, its ties with Russia and China. How do you think they would respond if the US and its allies started taking more of an aggressive stance with Iran, started using those types of deterrences that you're suggesting?
Katie, if you don't mind me just noting, you have a train of thought which is incredibly consistent, and it's a Western rational approach which you're projecting onto the Middle East or
Sorry.
onto all authoritarians, which is a rational cost benefit analysis approach. You think that punitive measures is going to lead to a harsh response. But what you see in the case of autocrats is that a non-responsive approach, a demonstration of your strategic priority of de-escalating, actually causes them to become more belligerent. So in the case of Russia, you see how Russia has acted towards Georgia and
Mm.
then subsequently towards Ukraine. You saw with Syria the multiple red lines that the Obama administration mentioned that all were contravened. You see with China the fact that we anticipated that by co-opting them, by having them join the World Trade Organization, we thought that economic liberalization would spill over to political democratization. And what happened was, during that period of time, we failed to hold China accountable. So you saw the growth of artificial islands in the South China Seas. You saw them flex their muscles towards Thailand or others with their string of pearls theory. You saw them adopting predatory economic mercantilism towards developing states in order to dominate them. You saw them having increasing cyber attacks against the West, then culminating in Hong Kong and potentially Taiwan. So this calculus that you have works when it comes to Western democracies, but it doesn't work when it comes to autocratic regimes that respect the stick, not carrots.
It's really interesting. Thank you. The and in terms of China and Russia and Iran, uh, what is Iran's current relationship with Russia and China? Are they close? Are they building on those ties?
Well, they're certainly building on those ties. So, for example, Russia is providing drones to Russia Iran is providing drones to Russia in its war against Ukraine. Russia, Iran, and China are studying the tactics deployed by Hamas and Hezbollah, which they use in their own respective theatres. And going back as well to the previous question as well, the international system has become so intertwined that if one sort of relinquishes control in one sphere of influence, if one is mild mannered, then your adversary flexes in another theatre. So, for example, if Israel was to have a ceasefire with Hamas in Gaza, then Iran would think, okay, we can flex our proxies to step up attacks in the north with Hezbollah or via the Houthis. Russia could think, okay, the international community is not going to hold us to account. We can step up our attacks against Ukraine. China then would be observing these dynamics and think, okay, is the West going to actually hold us to account if we're going to take on Taiwan? So I don't see these theatres as separate and distinct and siloed from one another. I think geopolitics is a lot more organic and fluid than we anticipate.
I completely agree there, very much so. Why do you think the US hasn't yet been aggressive with Iran? Why do you think they haven't stepped up and actually just gone, no, actually, no, you've gone too far here?
I think America's strategic priority, its geopolitical priority at the moment is on the Asian Pacific. They see a new Cold War that can rapidly escalate to a hot war with China. So it's great power politics. So they're very much focused on states as opposed to sub-states. And again, I think that categorization is very flawed because in the Middle East, if Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, Khatib al-Hezbollah in Iraq, if they are all sponsored by Iran, you can't make a distinction anymore between proxies and sponsor, states and sub-state actors. You've got a grey zone suddenly of where a state and a sub-state are synonymous with one another. America would like to keep it simple and create an arbitrary categorization of states versus sub-states. And as they want to pivot out of the Middle East and focus on the Asia Pacific, they would make these arbitrary distinctions and then think, okay, as a result of that, we're not going to focus on sub-state actors that are attacking our assets. We're not going to hold them to account because our strategic priority is the Asia Pacific.
And moving on, changing the subject slightly, cyber security, cyber attacks, so buzzwords of the past year or more. What are Iran's cyber capabilities? Could they launch, or have they been launching cyber attacks against our allies? Do they have the capability to do so? Could they respond with a significant cyber attack?
So we saw in 2020 Iranian hackers targeting the US election infrastructure. Now, in Israel in 2023, there was a 43% surge in cyber attacks against their entire infrastructure and even insurance companies. UK Minister for Security Tom Tugendhat has spoken about the evolving threat and the evolving capabilities of Iran's cyber security capabilities. So Iran is enhancing their cyber capabilities, and it also stands to reason that they would do so because if they are denied conventional parts, if they cannot upgrade their militaries, right, which led to a helicopter crash of their former president, if their infrastructure has eroded to such a great degree, then they need to enhance in the few outlets that they do have, and that would be nuclear and cyber.
And how do we, obviously our governments are have got their own cyber programs, but how do we, as private individuals, protect ourselves from an Iranian, sorry, cyber attack, or how do we protect ourselves from uh, interference in elections? Is there anything that we can do?
I think that there's going to be a growing trend of public-private partnership of sort of governments and that will have disproportionately large capabilities and private companies that are merging together, because this can disrupt, forget our security, it can disrupt our economies dramatically. So I think the trend will be to become ever more vigilant.
And speaking of trends, what do you think is going to happen in terms of how the US is going to develop, or even Western NATO, US, how we're going to develop our Iran policies and how we're going to respond to their, I think you called it unification of arenas,
Yes. Look,
attempts and attacks on Israel. What do you think is realistically, is there an appetite for being more aggressive with Iran, or do you think we're just going to keep going along the status quo until something happens?
Look, currently, there is no appetite. Currently, the Biden administration, it would rather relegate Israel's security to its own strategic interests, which is make nice to Iran in order that it can pivot towards the Asia Pacific. We see a clear example of this. So the whole Saudi deal that was meant to build on the Abraham Accords, it created a security architecture in the region between the US that underpinned it, GCC Sunni states, and Israel. And it was meant to deter Iran. Um, and provide an anchor for America's strategic interests while America focused on the Asia Pacific. What it has achieved is a tremendous defensive architecture, but it hasn't constituted deterrence as was initially anticipated. Now, due to the huge now, Iran saw how this was evolving. It saw that it was being alienated in the region. So they thought, okay, fine, we will create this crisis in the Middle East because they wanted to prevent Saudi Arabia from forging closer ties with Israel. So what happened as a result of that? And that indeed worked, because um, Saudi Arabia was on the brink of a peace agreement with Israel. Everybody was waiting with bated breath. And suddenly it all went on ice because of the crisis in Gaza. Um, what America wants to do to salvage this, and Biden is desperate to achieve this before the elections because he needs a legacy of some sort, a foreign policy win, is he wants to create a security um, agreement with Saudi Arabia, but it's predicated upon Israel achieving a ceasefire in
Mm.
Gaza. What this ends up achieving is, rather than deterring Iran, it emboldens Iran, because the whole purpose, what Saudi Arabia sought was a NATO-style security agreement. And of course, Saudi Arabia had Iran in mind. By having this vacuous security agreement that emboldens the aggressor that one sought to deter in the first place, makes it meaningless. So that's the current lack of appetite for confronting Iran. Another option would be to start holding Iran and its proxies accountable. Israel's had a very limited approach of just responding to its proxies on its borders. But what King Abdullah said in the WikiLeaks to President Obama, cut off the head of the snake. That's a strategy that's never been adopted.
That's brilliant. Thank you. This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much, Barak. And your report, I recommend that all of our listeners read it, because that contains significantly more data and information and assessments. And I've very much enjoyed reading it. I'm looking forward to listening to your podcast as well. Is it on Spotify or?
It is.
Yes,
It
brilliant.
is. So if you, in three different words, the Geo God or Geo Godfather Wars.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you, Katie. Thank you.
Brilliant. All right.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.